If you hit this URL, which is localhost:8080/greeting, you get a welcome message. And if you hit this URL, which is localhost:8080/users, you get details of 2 users. By the end of this video, you will be able to do this on your own using Spring Boot REST API. Creating a REST API with Spring Boot is very easy. First, we need to create a Spring project, and it can be done in 2 ways. If you have STS Spring Tool Suite, go to its File menu, select New, Other. Search for Spring, and select Spring Starter Project. Now fill in the details, such as the name of your project, which Java version you will be using, what is the build tool, Maven or Gradle, how the application will be bundled, it will be a jar or WAR, group ID, artifact ID and the package which you want to create. Click Next. This is the Dependencies section, where we add the dependencies required for our project. For a simple REST application, add Spring Web dependency. Click Finish. The project is ready. If you do not use Spring Tool Suite or cannot create a Spring project from IDE, then there is another method. Head over to start.spring.io and fill in all the details, as we did, while creating project from STS. Next, add dependencies, and search for Web. Select Spring Web dependency. Look what is written here. Build web, including RESTful applications using Spring. Select this, and click Generate. This will download a zip, and you can directly import it in your IDE. Back to our project. You can see that it created the package that we provided while creating the project. A class with main method is also created automatically. This class has Spring Boot application annotation, which enables Spring Boot configuration and enables bootstrapping of Spring application. To start a Spring Boot application with default settings, we use run method from Spring application class as shown here. Let's run this. Look. It started Tomcat server internally, which is listening at port 8080. This is because Spring Boot, by default, uses embedded Tomcat, which starts at port 8080. Changing this default port is possible, and so is replacing default server with some other one. We will look at all this in coming videos. To ensure that you do not miss those, do subscribe to the channel, or else keep coming back to check if there is a new video published. Till now, we do not have any URLs mapped in our application. So, let's create a handler for welcome URL that we saw at the start of this video, so that when we hit /greeting, a message is displayed. A URL mapping should be defined in a controller class, so create a new class. Name it mapping controller. You can name it as you like. Create a new method, which should be invoked when a URL is hit. Return a message that you want to display to end user. Technically, it is called response. Now, there are a couple of questions. How does Spring Boot know that this is a controller class, or that it contains URL mappings? It is through a REST controller annotation, which is applied at the class level. Second question is, how does Spring Boot know that when /greeting or a particular URL is hit, this method should be invoked? This is through another annotation, which is getMapping. The URL, or the path, for which this method should be invoked, is given after getMapping annotation, enclosed between parentheses and double quotes. When Spring Boot application starts, it looks for all the classes that have REST controller annotation and creates a mapping for all the methods in this class, which have getMapping, postMapping, deleteMapping annotations, corresponding to HTTP GET, POST and DELETE methods. The URL, or the path, for which this method should be invoked, is given after getMapping annotation, enclosed between parentheses and double quotes. Go to the browser and hit URL, localhost, since the application is running on the same system, followed by the port on which it is running, / the URL pattern, for which we created a handler method. Look, we get the same message that was returned from the method. Now, let's create a method that will return a list of users For this, first we need to create a new class that represents a user. Define fields for ID, name, and age of user. Generate getter and setter methods for these fields, if you use Spring Tool Suite or Eclipse. Then press Alt, Shift, and S keys together, followed by R key. Back to the controller class. Create a method, whose return type will be a list of user objects. Initialize an array list. Create a couple of user objects. And populate their fields with some values. Add these objects to the list. Since this method is returning a value, and does not change anything on the server, it should be an HTTP GET method, and hence, will be annotated with GET mapping. Provide a URL for which this method shall be accessible. Restart the application. Back to the browser. Again, provide the host, which will be localhost, followed by the port and the URL mapping that we just defined. Look! It returned an array of 2 user objects as a JSON. This is because the default response format of a Spring Boot application is JSON. Each element of this array represents a user object, and its keys are the same as the fields of user class. So, we have successfully created a REST service using Spring Boot. This REST service contains 2 URLs. But you can define as many URLs as per the requirement. Hope you like this video.